Yeah, love your work, Paul. I think it's just bloody awesome.
Truly Australian way to end an interview. Thank you, Nesh. I appreciate it.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking. Yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
I'm excited to bring you this episode of Better Thinking. I talk with Dr. Paul Atkins, who's an organisational psychologist with a PhD in psychology from Cambridge University. He's quite well known for his work in acceptance and commitment therapy and mindfulness-based stress reduction. But in particular, he talks about his new book, Prosocial, which is really an approach for enhancing cooperation in teams and using principles derived from social psychology, evolutionary theory, and economics. It's a great conversation about this concept of how human beings can work more productively together and work as a group to not only enhance the group, but also appreciating that it's already in line with the individual desires, wants and needs. You're going to love this episode, and please do share this and let others know about this podcast and this particular episode. I'm sure it's going to be of great value to many. Paul, firstly, a big congratulations on your new book, Prosocial, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Nesh. It's great to be here.
Tell us a little bit about this book, how it's come about. Obviously, the prosocial space, it's a fairly broad term. What does it mean? And maybe firstly, tell us a little bit about yourself and how this has come about.
Sure. Thanks, Nesh. Well, I'll just start with the term prosocial. Basically what we're trying to do, what this whole project is about, is building better quality human relationships and building more effective groups and groups of groups. So what we've done is we've taken some pieces of psychology and some pieces of political science and economics and evolutionary theory, and we've kind of woven those together into an approach which is evidence-based and is very practical for groups to be able to improve cooperation. You asked me about how I came into it. So Prosocial started when David Sloan Wilson met and worked with Elinor Ostrom, who's a Nobel Prize-winning political scientist who had basically developed 8 design principles that were needed to be in place in order for groups to function effectively. I can talk a bit more about that later as we get back to it. So he worked with Lynn Ostrom. Together they generalised Lynn's design principles to be applicable to all groups. What David recognised was that basically any group that wants to cooperate needs to have these things in place, these key ideas. So he worked with Lynn and then he paired up with Steve Hayes and a bunch of other people from the acceptance and commitment therapy or acceptance and commitment training space to help explore some of the behavioural technology that might be needed to actually implement these core design principles with groups. And then shortly after that, I came along and got involved, and I was fascinated with the project. I've been an organisational psychologist for 25 years. Most of my career has been about leadership and management and communication skills and conflict resolution and so forth. So I've just got this really deep interest in helping people have better relationships with others. I saw the need for us to develop training. So I've developed facilitator training packages that allow people to learn about prosocial. And I also took the lead on writing the book, which is what you mentioned, so to describe the process. So it's just been a real joy to me to be involved with this project. It feels like it's the kind of coming together of a whole lot of strands of my life, actually.
It's really interesting to me, this idea of how we can best work together. I just finished reading a book recently, Sapiens, which,
wonderful book.
Oh, it's absolutely fascinating. One of the things that kind of jumped out at me in particular was this idea about, if we took I think the example was something like an orangutan, and put myself against an orangutan, it would rip me apart. One-on-one, I would get destroyed. And I'm not sure if it's a baboon or orangutan, what I can't remember what the author used, but if we took 50 of us, humans versus, orangutans or baboons, they would once again absolutely annihilate us. There was a bit of a, I suppose part of the thesis in that book was the difference is that orangutans or baboons start fracturing socially at around the number 50. So, hierarchies start to break down, and there's different dominant structures, and how they lead, and so on and so forth. As we human beings have this amazing capacity, this is probably what you're talking about in terms of what Lynn's work has been on. Some of these factors that mean that human beings can come together and work together better than their other primate sort of counterparts. This sort of space of working together is just absolutely enthralling. I think it's amazing.
Yeah, I'm actually really delighted you brought in that example, because I think Yuval Noah Harari's book really clearly illustrates the importance of language in that process. And you're absolutely right. That is exactly what Ostrom's work did, was to identify the kind of absolute core agreements that a group needs to have in place in order to cooperate effectively. So Ostrom was writing in response to a dominant economic worldview, which you could kind of say it's Homo economicus, if you like. It's a particular view of humanity as being self-interested and, selfish, basically.
Sure.
And this view pervades economics over the last 50 years, and it also therefore pervades public policy, and yet it's utterly and completely wrong. And so that's why she won the Nobel Prize, for basically showing that unless you have the sort of extraordinary conditions where people aren't allowed to talk to each other or they're openly hostile, people can, and sometimes do, form agreements which allow them to cooperate incredibly effectively. I mean, I see you smiling.
What a strange concept.
I know. It seems like, wow, isn't that revolutionary? And I have wondered, wow, is that Nobel Prize worthy? But it is against the backdrop of a huge counter-narrative which has actually dominated the world. It's extraordinary. And to our detriment. It's an interesting example of how evolution can take us where we don't want to go. We've got evolution, if you like, of our culture in the direction of this kind of neoliberal particular way of viewing the world, which has been selected for by certain conditions but does not serve the majority of us well.
And there is that sort of leaning towards individualism, right? When in actual fact, thought popped into my head around the idea of, MySpace or Facebook. Originally, it was about my page, and everything about me. But, what won out was in actual fact groups, that as much as we all like to have that individualism about ourselves, we actually want to be part of a group, or part of an event. Am I interested in going to this event, or will I be participating? Who do I like? What is my group? It ends up being, more about my group rather than me. That's what it appears like anyway.
I think it's one of the sort of learnings I got from writing the book, and I contacted this idea over many years, was there is no me separate from others. Like I am utterly a part of my social context, and the whole idea of an individual means, if you look at the root of it, it means indivisible, like a sort of fundamental unit. But we're not. If you look from the point of view of multi-level selection, which is the evolutionary theory that the book is based on, it's groups all the way up and down. I am already a group of conflicting thoughts and ideas and emotions, which some of which have a voice at sometimes, others only occasionally. Every word I'm using I've learned from someone else, and every concept, even being in the presence of you right now is shaping how I'm responding. It's just we live and breathe in a social space, and we're evolved to live and breathe in a social space and to actually care for others, not just exploit others for what we can get, which has been I think the dominant narrative for quite some time has been this sort of belief that what people primarily care about is their own outcomes and individual well-being separate from others. But it's just not true. Empirically, if you look at even pre-verbal children are thinking socially. They're taking actions that indicate they're not only aware of socially helpful and unhelpful actors in the system, but they actively preference more prosocial actors. So this is experiments with little puppets and things that are done with pre-verbal, even babies. So we can talk some more about that if you like.
Yeah, please. There's a particular piece of research, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, and you may have come across it, you probably have, where looking at sort of how people relate to each other and using mice as an example, where there was a larger mouse and a smaller mouse, and they tend to kind of play like human beings do, where they wrestle with each other. Maybe I've even heard this from you, I'm not sure. And they wrestle from each other, and obviously the dominant mouse or the larger mouse wins. And so you take the mice apart and put them back into the box again, and what develops from that is the superior or more dominant mouse has to be asked by the submissive or smaller mouse to play. Mm-hmm. And then the large one gets to kind of ask, gets to either accept or deny. And obviously, they both want to play, so it accepts on this occasion, and they play again. No surprises there. The large mouse wins again and pins the little one down. But what they found is that on the third or fourth play session, the little one pins the large one down. And it's kind of this fascinating thing of, how does this occur? And in actual fact, what the researchers have found is that if the large mouse does not allow the little one to pin him some of the time, and it's about 30% of the time, the little one will stop asking to play. So there's this inherent natural thing that's going on inside us that says, I need to be prosocial, to have others around, because this is a biological need. And I think all of us who have been good at something in our lives, we've thrown a game. I do it with my daughter all the time when we play but at the same time I will beat her as well. But there's something about whether it's teaching or sort of an inherent biological want for her to smile or to be happy about that. I will throw plenty of games, I'm sure all parents have. But it's quite interesting because we do this with friends.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great example, isn't it, of this basic evolutionary pressure, if you like, that there's always two sides to a relationship and we need to take care of the other in that process. Otherwise, the relationship is going to break, and we are utterly relational beings. So I think it's a beautiful example. I've heard similar stories with rats, and certainly in higher primates and so forth, there's much more sophisticated examples of sharing and cooperation, and it's just not the case that animals act purely for their self-interest, or to look at it another way, their self-interest is often aligned with the interests of others because of the need for our deep, deep need for social connection.
And where do you say this sort of comes from in your research? You've obviously drawn on a number of different disciplines. Can you talk us through about how these disciplines come together, or what's the explanation of that the individual need in actual fact is more often than not aligned with others' needs or the group need?
Sure. Well, I think in terms of prosocial, it has three main kind of bases in terms of literatures that it draws upon. Our fundamental worldview is evolutionary, and what I mean by that is that we're interested in variation, selection and retention of behaviour in particular, I mean, most people think about evolution as being kind of genetic evolution. Genes vary, particularly successful genes are selected for and retained through the hereditary processes. But the same thing, what's become really clear in evolutionary theory over the last decades is that the same sorts of processes are occurring in individual behaviour and also in cultural evolution. So we're informed by this basic idea that there's a high degree of variability and that things that work in terms of what matters to us are selected for and retained. So that sort of runs through everything that we do.
What's an example, my apologies before you move
Sure.
on. What's an example of the cultural, I suppose, variation or selection that
Yeah.
you might see?
I think one of the examples would be the one I gave earlier, for instance, the selection of a particular narrative about who we are, for instance, or, climate change is an interesting one too, that when you consider why is it that, well, I'm going to display my biases here, but I think it's probably most people are aligned with this. Why is it that climate change has been denied for so long? It's a pretty clear example of a particular story that's worked for a subgroup of the population that is in power. And so they have the means and ability to push that particular story. So that's an example of how there can be variability in even what's seen as the truth, the story about the truth,
Sure.
and how one particular story can be selected because the conditions are right for that story to be retained and promulgated through social media or through the Murdoch press.
Sure. Not mentioning
Not
any
mentioning
names.
any names, of course. No, I'll probably get sued for that. Maybe I should take that out. But it's so anyway. That's an example of cultural transmission of a particular idea. Of course, science is a counter narrative to that too, and it draws upon ideas of objectivity and replicability and so forth. So right throughout history, different stories about who we are and what we want and what we care for have been evolving, basically. One of the things that I find intriguing about prosocial is, and why I like the fact that it's based in this really solid science of evolutionary theory, is that it points to the possibility of conscious evolution of our society, that we might actually, if we can create stories of Homo economicus or other stories of who we are, then we can create new stories. And
I've never heard that term. That's just kind of hit me. The conscious evolution.
Absolutely.
How much of evolution we're a part of. It's not just me procreating and passing on, the product of my parents and their parents and, maybe part of my environment, but more so about what I consciously think about. That's the way I'm hearing it. The way I consciously organise my ideas, the amount of time I spend, making myself aware or educating myself, the way I behave and treat others, etc.
Yeah. We're all part of this process. I think this is one, we tend to look to the government, for instance, to lead us in particular directions, but I think it is more helpful to think of a whole lot of narratives that are competing for space, a whole lot of stories that are competing for space. If you look, even since the bushfires in Australia, it's now the selection conditions for a particular story around this. We're on the cutting edge of climate change here in Australia. That story has started to gain momentum. So the selection conditions are there for that story to be repeated and shared between us. And as a result, it's starting to really gain hold. Maybe the story about animals and animal welfare, which has really just been nowhere in the whole environmental discussion until recently. But now people are actively thinking about that. So, you've got these variants, if you like, in the population of memes that have been struggling for expression, but now the selection conditions are right that they can be replicated. So I tend to think of all of what we do as being situated in multiple streams of evolution. You asked about the different perspectives. What's interesting about this evolutionary perspective is that it occurs in multiple streams. So I've already talked about genetics, there's epigenetics, there's behavioural stream, there's a symbolic stream, there's a cultural stream. So in all of those spaces there's constant variation, selection, retention. But it's also occurring at multiple levels. The distinction between individual behaviour and cultural behaviour, shared behaviour is one level distinction, but you can make finer grain ones. You can say, there's an evolution at the level of me as a person, there's evolution at the level of Canberra, that's evolving. At the level of maybe a team that I'm part of, that's evolving. So all the way up and down, there's groups and groups of groups and groups of groups of groups. So what is key in all of those levels is purpose in one way or another. Because purpose, the way we think about what matters to us, call it values, call it purpose, call it our aims, whatever you call it, they form the selection conditions for behaviours to be replicated, right? If our purpose is to make heaps and heaps of money and be individually successful, we get selection for Homo economicus. If our purpose is to create a society where people can breathe the air, then we get selection for very different cultural memes. So purpose runs through everything, which is why the second part, well, first of all, that was how David and Lynn developed the first core design principle is shared identity and purpose. Without shared identity and purpose, you can't have genuinely collective action because it's not aligned, which has got individuals working against one another. But purpose is also fundamental to ACT, which, is basically a functionalist theory of therapy. We're not interested in what's true in some objective sense. We're focused on what's workable, what helps us move in the direction of what really matters. So this conversation about what really matters and how do we get there together is evolution in action from our perspective. So I'll just briefly, though, we sort of jumped around there, but for the listener, three main bases of prosocial are evolutionary theory, Lynn Ostrom's work on the commons, which I can talk a little more about if you like.
Please do.
And this particular approach to behaviour change, which some people know as acceptance and commitment training or therapy, others know as contextual behavioural science.
Maybe we can step into Lynn Ostrom's work.
Sure. So she studied groups all around the world that managed what the economists call common pool resources. Basically think of it as the commons. So these are spaces where there are shared resources like fisheries or water supplies and so forth. In 1968, there was an article published in Science by a man called Garrett Hardin, who's an ecologist, and he called the article The Tragedy of the Commons. And this became an extraordinarily dominant metaphor in economics. The idea was that if you have a pasture where farmers are free to put as many cows as they like, that they will inevitably, invariably, inexorably put more cows on the land than can be managed, because it's in their individual self-interest to put as many cows on the land as possible. Therefore, I can't remember the exact language, but it's something like inevitably they will rush towards doom or something like that. Sure. I must get the quote right. And it's extraordinary when you read this article because it's meant to be, it's in Science for God's sake, and it's like written more like the Bible than it is, it's like these proclamations. And I think that's why it was so rhetorically effective. Basically, it was seen as this universal idea that they would all rush towards over-exploiting the resource. But it's based on a fundamentally flawed premise, which is that they're not talking to each other and they can't see the collective interest. And actually what Ostrom's work showed really carefully, looking at groups that had managed shared resources for thousands of years, was that if you can talk to one another and you can develop agreements, social agreements, then you can create the conditions where things can work sustainably for literally thousands of years, or in the case of First Nations people in Australia, tens of thousands of years. And so what are those kind of core conditions? That's what her project was about. And she identified 8 that we've picked up on. I mean, there are others that you could identify in particular groups. So what I'll give you is kind of our version, if you like, of these core design principles, because they have been slightly tweaked. She was focused on just groups managing the commons. We're interested in, for example, organisations or groups of groups involved in political change or whatever. So we needed to generalise them just a little bit, but I'll tell you about that. So the 8 core design principles, and you can learn about these on our website, prosocial.world, or on the training website, prosocialinstitute.org. The 8 principle, where there's a download there on prosocialinstitute.org that outlines these. The 8 principles are, first one is shared identity and purpose, which I've already talked about. Without that, there's no sense of us as a collective. There's no alignment of action. The second one is equity, basically, that there needs to be fairness in distribution of costs and benefits. So in a group you need to have a balance of workload and reward for that. And I'm not just talking about extrinsic rewards of sort of salary and, little payoffs. What I'm really focused on is social rewards, the recognition, the, social engagement, social interaction, learning opportunities and those sorts of things need to be shared fairly within a group for it to be sustainable. One of the strongest findings from organisational psychology is that if there's inequity, it's toxic and it'll corrode everything. The third principle is fair and inclusive decision-making. The aspect of that I find most interesting is contexts where you can create real involvement in decision-making. So an approach called consent-based decision-making that is becoming increasingly popular in groups all around the world. Basically, we're not arguing against hierarchy, but we are arguing that hierarchy comes with some serious costs. Top-down coercive forms of leadership come with some serious costs. And in the spirit of, the pragmatic approach that I mentioned earlier, we need to look at those costs and see whether they're workable in our modern, rapidly changing organisations. So fair and inclusive decision-making. Basically, the idea there is that people who are affected by decisions need to be involved in the making of them. Otherwise, self-interest can thrive. All of these principles that I'm laying out for you, they function to shift the attention and effort from selfishness to collective action. Okay, so that's 3. 4 is Ostrom called it monitoring of behaviour, agreed behaviours. I'm starting to call it transparency of behaviour. Basically, you can't have an effective group if people can't see if others are sticking to the agreements, right? You need to be able to see it. So I can think of tons of examples of virtual groups and so forth, or even in situations of corruption. It thrives in darkness, right? It thrives in invisibility. So transparency.
That word transparency makes more sense, sure.
Yeah. The fifth one is basically responding appropriately to helpful and unhelpful behaviours. So you can think of that as feedback, because most of the time our responding is words, and we're giving feedback to people to try to encourage the helpful stuff and discourage the unhelpful stuff. So that's one that's very different to the way Ostrom thought about it. She thought about it as graduated sanctions for misbehaviours. But it's really clear that if you look at work groups, you can't just rely on sanctions. You need to also have reinforcement in place. So that's 5. 6 is fast and fair conflict resolution. All groups that are values-driven, there's going to be conflict. It's inevitable. The key is to try to focus the conflict on task, not people, and personalities, and to be comfortable with, to develop the skills to be able to be comfortable with conflict as being a clash of perspectives or differences of perspectives rather than something that necessarily needs to engage a fight-flight response. The seventh principle is authority to self-govern. And so what that's about is basically, the way I like to think of it is, the group needs to have enough authority to be able to implement the first 6 principles. The counterexamples, sometimes it's easier to talk about counterexamples. Unfortunately, here in Canberra, we have the Federal Public Service. A lot of groups that I've done work with over the years in the Federal Public Service. So it's not unfortunate that we've got the public service, but unfortunately they oftentimes don't have the authority in a team to actually manage those processes. So they can't manage their own conflict, for instance. They have to refer it to human resources, or the purpose is so constantly shifting in response to the latest piece of media that it's almost impossible for a team leader in the Federal Public Service, in many instances, to actually create a coherent, coordinated set of activity towards a shared purpose. So authority to self-govern is basically the first one that's about, not just about the internal functioning, but how the group relates to the rest of its environment, its context. And the last one, Ostrom called it polycentric governance. We just talk about appropriate or good relations with other groups using all those same principles. So groups of groups need to have shared identity and purpose. There needs to be equity between groups. There needs to be inclusive decision-making between groups and so forth, in order transparency, effective feedback and responding, fast and fair conflict resolution, all between groups. They all work at any level. That's what's, I think, probably unique and new about Prosocial, is that our principles are kind of obvious, like a lot of any management texts would sort of converge on the same ideas in a way, but they have not been articulated in that way that allows you to scale them up or down. They work just as well for a marriage relationship as they do for a team, as they do for a team of teams. Like one group that we're working with at the moment is Transition Network, which is a overarching body that brings together a whole lot of different transition towns that are trying to work more effectively in the context of climate change and environmental sustainability. And so there you've got basically a clustering of volunteers all around the world. How do you coordinate activity between those groups and those groups of groups when there isn't clear authority lines and so forth? Prosocial gives us a shared language. Those 8 design principles are a kind of shared language for how we can cooperate more effectively.
It's fascinating. I mean, every single one of those items that you discussed and explained kind of just immediately resonates. It kind of says, "Oh, of course, of course," but they're not very accessible otherwise. It's not a list I would just come up with. Obviously a lot of time and energy has gone into seeing each of these factors and how important they are for this ongoing tension between what's good for the group versus what's good for the individual, and having this this intent or focus on the group and but also having enough space that from an individual perspective it still feels fulfilling. That's that fairness, or if there's conflict, that it's fast and fair, that it's resolved, that there's transparency because the individual can get carried away. A lot of this feels like there's this kind of these 8 are based around trying to hold a particular type of tension to get that best outcome for all, and it's not really, the way I'm kind of looking at it from a metaphor perspective is it's not actually trying to hold a perfect tension. It's just being mindful of, we're looking for a particular type of tension, and when it kind of slackens, we go out and tighten it up, and when it goes and gets too tight, we slacken it up, and it's kind of an organic move. I mean, that's just kind of what visually comes to mind. For me, it's trying to kind of capture both the individual and the group, or the individual within the group, but the group being obviously as a collective and cohesive entity working together for, as you say, that shared purpose.
Yeah, I really like the way you. Actually, it's delightful to hear you say that, because I like the way you said the individual within the group, because I think this gets back to the worldviews thing we were talking about before. At some really deep level, we've been told that we're separate. And so that then sets up the idea that there's a tension between individual interests and collective interests, whereas in fact there's always one form of the story or one form of the view where actually our interests are deeply aligned. And so in practice it's more often about finding the alignment of individual interests and collective interests and creating a way that we can be together where our interests are aligned. So it's about integrating individual interests and collective interests rather than this is where there are sort of different views. You can view Ostrom's work as being about suppression of self-interest and favouring of collective interest, but I prefer to see it as integration of the two, of really honouring the individual and but acknowledging that the individual is already fundamentally social, if that makes sense. That alternative view, it's interesting because if you look in biology and the way that David has talked about multi-level selection in terms of organisms like termites and so forth. So David, I mean David Sloan Wilson, my co-author, who I believe is going to be on this program as well. To create what he would call a major evolutionary transition where a bunch of separate organisms begin to behave so cooperatively that they function as a single organism, like a termite mound or a human body, for instance, because we're actually made up of evolutionarily separate organisms. Our cells are originally separate organisms and they just happen to cooperate so effectively that we can call ourselves a single individual. If we get cancer, that's where a single cell is behaving selfishly. So this idea of groups all the way up and down, we are all groups, is absolutely prevalent. So you can think of, to continue that metaphor, say cells within our body, you could say that you need to sort of suppress the individual interests of cells so that they can't just replicate randomly in order to have the good of the group. You could see cancer and the removal of cancer through that lens. But you could also say, cancer kills the host. It's the end of the organ. It's the end of the cell as well. So if you draw your attention out a little bit, it's actually in the long-term interests of every individual cell to behave cooperatively within the body. And in that sense, you see that's a different story.
Absolutely.
But if all you do is focus on my sole aim is to replicate as much as possible, you'll get one story. If you focus on my aim is to survive over the long term, then quite often it'll be a different story.
And this is, I suppose, the argument of climate change, what we're doing to the environment on an individual basis. It's really fantastic if I go out and have a big trawling ship, fisheries ship, going out there with this enormous net. Each time I come back, I've got X amount of, tons of tuna or whatever fish I'm trying to target. And just by going out and looking after my own interests, through my lifetime, I'll probably do exceptionally well. I might be able to pass that on to my kids and maybe my kids' kids. This is kind of what's historically occurred. But eventually that cancer sort of shows up and says, oh my goodness, there's either something irreparable or, we have to start treating this cancer and addressing it from a prosocial way, because none of us are going to have fish. And as a matter of fact, forget fish, there will be a whole lot of other domino effects that will end up taking us all out.
Yeah, look at how many people later in life kind of question what their whole life's been about, when they've acted selfishly for their whole life. It does not serve them well, generally speaking, for their entire life. And it takes a particular form of attention. And this is where I think, you mentioned the book Sapiens, I think really describes this beautifully, and hopefully our book does too. If you pay attention to how can I get as much as how can I consume as much as possible for myself, then that takes you in one direction. If you pay attention to the possibility of us all thriving in one way or another, then it creates different possibilities.
Try and explain that. I'm struggling with that, right? I mean, I'm hearing. Sorry for jumping in, but I'm hearing there's this kind of space where I want more, right? I'm in this race for resources, and the more I get, the better I feel, right? I feel more secure, or I feel more accomplished. I feel like I've achieved something, whatever it might be. And there's this other paradigm that you're kind of proposing, which says, but maybe if I share in this pursuit, or I make sure I look after my fellow man or my fellow animal or my fellow world, that I will get some equally valuable return. Like there will be a reward at the end. It's just hard for me to see that, right? I mean, it's difficult for an individual to conceive that. It's like, what do you mean you're asking me to, not make as much money, or, I've got to share my resources that I work so hard to get. Can you try and talk through that a little bit?
What you're really pointing to is this sort of fundamental dilemma of why would we ever be altruistic? Why would we ever sacrifice for the good of the group, if that makes sense? And I think
there's also this, my apologies jumping again, but it's almost like, but maybe I don't like some of the people in the group, right? There's all this kind of self-interest that starts showing up, I'm doing most of the work. Why should they, benefit? It's kind of like the taxes issue, right? I shouldn't have to pay more tax.
Yeah. So again, I think, at least for me, I see myself, I'm going to speak quite personally here.
Yeah, please.
I see myself as having evolved from being pretty selfish, basically. I'm going to say that on it. As a young man, I was pretty much all about my career, my success, my income, et cetera, and the evolution that I've seen in myself has been that those victories are often hollow if there isn't someone there to share them with, if there isn't a deep network of connections to share them with. And so to the extent that I trust that I can be loved, that I can be part of a community and so forth, for me that's a much richer form of outcome. It's a much more satisfying life to lead, to be able to maybe forego in the very short term some small economic outcome or even a large economic outcome, and then to be able to rest in the peace and sensibility of knowing that I've done something worthwhile in the world. I just inserted that piece that I need to trust that I am going to be lovable, that I'm going to be accepted, that I'm going to be part of a community, that I will not be, that others are not selfish. Because if I don't trust that others are not selfish, why on earth would I behave altruistically? There's just it would be irrational. And this is why I've emphasised the importance of the stories we tell about who we are. There's really good evidence. This is some work from Common Cause. It's a fascinating online report called Perceptions Matter. I can link to it off your site if you like. And basically what they showed was, to the extent that people think that others are selfish, they're much less prosocial themselves. So they don't vote as much. They don't take part in community groups as much. They don't initiate other forms of prosocial behaviour, to the extent that they see others as being self-interested, right? And that makes perfect sense, right? If you live in a world, obviously we need to protect our own organism. The cell needs to protect its own integrity. The organism does indeed need to protect itself. And also the cell and us looking out on our environment when we see hostility and selfishness and aggression, what we get is fight, flight and a retreat into basically individualism. But when we see a benevolent environment where there's the possibility of reciprocity, where there's the possibility of, harmony in one way or another, then we're much more likely to act for the good of others. And that's another way to view the core design principles, is they create the conditions where people can't easily act selfishly.
Why shouldn't I throw rubbish in the river? Because everyone else is going to be throwing rubbish in the river, so it's polluted anyway. So why should I stop? It's easier for me to just throw rubbish in the water and get rid of trash that way than it is to walk 6 blocks to put it in some sort of place. And this is trying to gain that trust of, no, we all it might be dirty and have filth and rubbish in it at the moment, but collectively we all believe in it's important to look after our rivers, so let's start looking after. I mean, I know Australia's done an exceptional job, and I do apologise because I can't remember who it was, but it's actually probably by hundreds of or thousands of or tens of thousands of people working together about the Clean Up Australia Day, that you don't go out and, litter on our beaches, or, if you go camping, pick up all of your stuff, that there's bins around, make sure you use the bins. In actual fact, these days it's use the bins correctly. Don't throw a cigarette on the ground. There's this kind of collective, consciousness around look after our environment, and that's probably a higher order. It's probably not the right language, but a different level of awareness that, a modern world allows us to think about versus, other prosocial contexts.
Yeah, well, you could call it a cultural norm, and it's what allows us to cooperate on a vast scale. As you were saying earlier, primates don't have cultural norms because they don't share language in the same way that we do. Because
that wasn't always the case, right? I remember driving from Canberra to Sydney, when I was a young boy, and you'd see rubbish all along the sides, people throwing McDonald's bags out and all sorts of things. It was just, what do you do with this? It's in the car. Well, get rid of it. Chuck it out the window.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, to use your example, so we're at the point where we're still, I guess, actively trying to promote not littering, but it's basically become the dominant norm in Australia. And so now if I litter, I know that actually my piece of litter is really making a difference. Whereas if, it's like the broken window stuff, that if there's already a broken window, people are much more likely to break another one. People need to know that their activities make a difference.
Well, we just painted the facade of our building because there's graffiti and it's this ongoing sort of effort to continue to go out and paint, when graffiti does show up. And it's kind of difficult because some of our, fellow neighbours, residents aren't as active in painting theirs. And so you can find, part of the block that looks a little bit more derelict and, has had graffiti on there for some time, and then other sections where you can see a number of other tenants who have all looked after their space. You can feel it's more inviting. It's a warmer place. You want to kind of be in there. You want to avoid the others a little bit more, but it requires that collective because one painted facade is stands out almost to be graffitied than the others, but in actual fact, it starts potentially I don't know, maybe not a movement, but at least a consciousness of saying, oh, that looks nice, maybe I'll do that to mine.
Yeah. I think it's a good example. I'd love to come back to, you asked before about why should I be prosocial.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, you must encounter this as a therapist when you've got a client who's, you're asking them what really matters to you, and they come back with a range of things, which might include being famous, making more money, et cetera, and, dominating at work or something like that. And you kind of, generally speaking, I mean, I guess I'm interested to hear how you'd handle that. But in my experience, when you start to ask the question, what really shows up for you in the space of this? How does it play out? How workable are those sorts of strategies? People find that they're kind of yucky in one way or another. They're not actually going to work that well in the long run. So, I mean, I'm not naive. People can be awful. People can be absolutely not fundamentally evil, because I believe that we're actually evolved to be deeply prosocial, but under the right conditions, all you can see is fight-flight response. All you can see is self-protection. So I don't believe I'm naive, but I do think that if you create the right context, and particularly if people are helped to kind of notice what works for them in the short and the long term.
Well, I think what you pose is really, at least in my mind, a therapeutic process of trying to asking a client to begin to ponder, consider, think about, question who and what's important, and initially people will talk about, the what's important, and it can be very, very much like, money and, resources, etc. I think when I talk about it from a process perspective, often clients require multiple questions, multiple repetitions of the same question to take that further. For example, if you did gain all that money, what would you do with it? And it might be, I'd get that large house that I've always wanted, or that nice car, or whatever it might be. It's like, and then, what would you do with that then? And really you're fishing for who's going to be in there. At least that's what you're hoping for, because most people, if it dawns on them that they're just sitting in a mansion, that's a really awful place to be in, and I think it's no different to having a really nice meal but having no one to share it with. There's that human need. No, I think I can use the word fundamental need to share it with someone. Not every time, but obviously in how we like to live our lives. So I think there's this ongoing process of continuing to ask that question of, and then what would you do? And then what would you do? And then what would you do? And I think it does tend to boil down to, I would share it. I would share it with loved ones, or I would share it with others, with my neighbours, maybe my street, maybe my colleagues, or maybe my group, the group that I'm interested in, whether it be, a special interest group, or whether it be, a body that I belong to or I believe in, whatever community that's interesting to me. I think it tends to boil down. So therapeutically, I think it's this process of continue to ask, and then what? What do you do with this? Because, most of us, when it boils down, it's not money that we're looking for. Because money, plus loneliness, money's pretty ordinary.
Yeah, I think most of us in the end, we want to be agentic in the world. We want to have an impact, but we also want to be loved and cared for. We want to belong. And that's pretty much kind of what things boil down to in one way or another. I was thinking as you were talking that, you were focused on money. In my career, early on, I was actually would say to people, I want to be famous. That was a kind of core thing for me.
Sure.
And then to realise, how that was just a proxy for wanting to be accepted and wanting to be appreciated in one way or another. And then, actually the appreciation of having however many friends on Facebook or whatever is pretty damn hollow compared to somebody who I've helped, and been able to work alongside. So, I really like your approach there as sort of and then what, and then what, because it's basically just going deeper and deeper. What really matters here. But see, we don't have that kind of conversation on a societal level. We don't have the what really matters here. We're locked in left versus right and good versus bad, and, you know, we're locked in these category labels that are obscuring the conversation about what matters right here, and how does it feel to engage in these behaviours. You know, imagine if politicians sort of were allowed to slow down and reflect on what's showing up for them to prosecute a particular line that they don't really believe in anymore. Imagine how behaviour could be different.
Yeah, is that part of the challenge around prosocial, that not taking the time to be considerate, to think about these concepts, that we're just rushing so much, and you know, in a environment of rushing and you know, where people are attacking each other, you know, whether it be, you know, socially or through media, or certainly our policy makers are kind of being you know, crucified at any moment. You know, I think it was the most terrible job in the world to be, you know, constantly on edge about every word that you say. It doesn't facilitate a deeper, more meaningful conversation, something that's maybe a little bit more sophisticated, something that kind of says, why do we want to make this policy, you know, such, and can we trust that the community is able to appreciate this and handle this and understand this, and therefore not dethrone me? You know, can I stick my neck out, you know, and you know, in some sense risk my individual security for the betterment of you know, society, you know, and can I trust that they will see that, you know, that I actually am part of a group, you know, that group actually does exist, rather than the group I'm currently in, you know, that might, you know, try and, you know, crucify me.
Absolutely. I think you're spot on, Nesh. Like, there's two bits, I think, in what you say. One is the compression of time frames, and invariably when you compress everything down, we're going to go into a more reactive mode rather than a more considered mode that allows us to contact what's actually happening for us here. But the other thing is to come back to that earlier point that we made about your expectations of others shape what you do. If your expectation is that any form of openness about your own individual vulnerability is going to be met with criticism or punishment in one way or another, the last thing you're going to be is open and vulnerable. And yet vulnerability is where trust comes from. Like, you think, what is trust? Ultimately, trust is knowing that I can make mistakes or be a bit of a dill in one way or another, and others will respond with some degree of, well, I won't be deeply punished for that. You know,
Sure.
It's not that I'll necessarily be reinforced for it, but I won't be crucified for a mistake or a slip up or something like that. It's in that sort of environment in a workplace that you have trust. And so, you know, again, to come back to this point, you can see how deeply we are not individuals. Every action I take, you know, there's this silly kind of Western view actually that actions emerge from this inner causative agent, you know, like this little separate homunculus that's inside me. It doesn't. My actions emerge from what I think you're going to do in response. I'm basically responding to a history of reinforcement, right? And in that history of reinforcement, there might have been all sorts of pain and abuse and so forth, and I'm going to be responding in an antisocial way. Or there might have been the possibility of trust, there might have been the possibility of openness, there might have been the possibility of care, and I can respond in a more prosocial way.
Paul, obviously, you know, you've worked. I mean, this book is really the focal point of a lot of the work that you've done, you know, to date, and you know, that goes far beyond, just the work that you've done in organisations, but, obviously worked with other, incredible people. I understand you do, training, you work with organisations. Can you talk us through maybe an example of how you've worked with an organisation to, I'm assuming they'd probably come to you and say, we've got some cultural sort of challenges that we're facing, or we're not kind of aligned, there's competing demands, we're finding this team is, butting heads with this other team. How can we put this all together? Can you talk about how you've worked with, organisations, how organisations, on the ground have applied some of these so that maybe, others can learn from, examples or how this might look on the ground?
Wonderful. Well, I'm tempted to tell you about the examples I've got in train at the moment because they're so exciting. So one of the groups that I'm actually, better what you actually ask. I'm changing your question. What you actually ask for examples from the past. We've done some great work with.
You can do current as well. Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, I might go with that for now then. So, I mean, generally speaking, what I do with organisations is I'm working with them to help improve communication so that they can explore each of these core design principles together. But I'm also trying to build what you might call psychological flexibility, which I'm sure most listeners to this program will understand. I'm trying to build psychological flexibility to enable people to look at those principles and implement them flexibly. Because each one of those core design principles I mentioned earlier could be done really rigidly and really unhelpfully. Think of a conflict resolution process that relies upon really strict policy and procedures instead of skill in actually talking, or even shared identity and purpose. Think of your classic vision statement that nobody pays any attention to because it's been lost in the words and the form rather than the execution of it. So, I work with companies to help develop teamwork. I've worked with schools at the level of helping them to use the ACT matrix, which is part of our process is the ACT matrix, which basically allows people to really connect with what they care about, but also what they're afraid of, their loves and their fears, if you like. And all of that is an expression of values. So this, the whole point of the ACT work is to help people become aware of what really matters to them in the context. And that can sometimes be, values in the direction of the collective, like I care about honesty or I care about relationship or something, but it can also be self-protective stuff as well. I care about not being made to look a fool or something. So we did some work with a school in Sydney which is already incredibly collaborative, actually. It's a Catholic learning community, and they were very interested in sort of seeing if Prosocial could push forward this the level of collaboration among the teachers in the school. So what we did was we ran a series of sessions where we introduced the individual ACT matrix, the collective ACT matrix, and the core design principles, and then did a whole lot of goal setting around how can you be different in your teaching teams. A lot of their work is done in collaborative teaching teams where they're sort of teaching a large group of students together. And so that's what we were targeting, was the collaboration between teachers. So the individual matrix was all about, what matters to you about being a member of this school, about being a member of this group. What's your individual interest? Getting that out there and mapping it. Then the collective matrix, if you like, which is just a collective version of the individual matrix. It's just, what matters to us as a group, basically. What are we afraid of? What do we do when we're really stuck in our fears and concerns? What could we be doing when?
And that makes so much sense. Before you finish up there, it makes so much sense to go through the individual stuff first, to validate that, to hear that, to appreciate it, so that people feel heard, and understood, and therefore maybe make it a little bit more or foster open-mindedness about there's also the collective that exists. If we just do the collective, we've created a tension once again in that, but what about me? And to hear both sides kind of disarm, so to speak, or opens ears. That's beautiful. My apologies. Keep going.
That's a good point though, Nesh. I mean, I'm amazed at how often people kind of rock back in their chairs almost when they see. I often use an online tool for the individual matrix these days, and people can enter their responses anonymously. Then you press a button and everybody can see what everybody else wrote, not just their values, but also their fears and their concerns and forgive the language, the crap that they do when they're really stuck in those fears and concerns, or the positive things that they want to do. And what people just go, wow, the overwhelming feeling in this group process is one of shared humanity, Both my loves and my fears are, generally speaking, shared. And sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're a little bit different. And that's interesting too, because suddenly I've learned that this really irritating behaviour that my colleague is doing comes out of something. It's not just because they're evil. It comes out of a way of viewing the world or a particular fear or approach that if I can step inside that, I've got a much better sense of what their core needs are and how I might address those. So to come back to the intervention, the process was one session around individual matrix, one session of sort of more a collective identity, what do we really care about? And then you can use the core design principles to kind of direct attention, if you like. We were talking about that earlier. The importance of where you pay attention determines the success of the group. It's basically the selection conditions. And so the core design principles are kind of like, okay, we need to pay attention now. We've paid attention to shared purpose, but we also, if we're going to actually implement our goals, we also need to pay attention to equity. We need to pay attention to how we make decisions together, et cetera, et cetera. So, and again, you can use the collective act matrix to explore those questions. So you can put up, what is it about inclusive decision making that really matters to us? What gets in the way of us doing it? What shows up? And like if I can just use that as an example, oftentimes in hierarchical organisations, for managers, they're afraid of inclusive decision making because they think they're going to lose control, and they'll be accountable for stuff that they had no control over, which is a fair enough concern. The people in the teams really don't want it because it's going to take too long, and they have to, become educated on stuff that is time consuming and so forth. Or maybe they'll make the wrong decision and then they're held to account for it, et cetera, et cetera. So these fears are real and they come out of sensible places and they need to be talked about. Otherwise, they're not going to actually be able to implement the principles effectively. But in this process with the school, for instance, what was really key and what I think probably made quite a bit of difference was for the teams to start setting some collective goals together and then to monitor those goals over a number of weeks. And, it's pretty basic stuff for psychologists. We're often helping our clients to set goals and then tracking how they do on those goals. But it's something that groups are often too busy to do, and the world is changing too quickly for them to be able to think about things in terms of intentions and then monitoring how successfully they're moving towards the intentions. I want to say that I don't see goal setting as kind of like this sort of rigid process of this is my performance outcome that I'm going to try and hit. Yeah. I see it much more as a learning process, like a learning cycle, if you like. So with groups, you're often sort of trying to get a sense of what could you do first in the short to medium term, how could you track how well that works, how could you learn from it. That's what I think of as goal setting, but you have to be doing that stuff. Otherwise, it's just all talk.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like a bit of an art form. I remember when I went to one of my placements a long time ago now, there was a gentleman who was I suppose in charge of the eating disorders unit in here in Canberra and Woden. I think he might even still be there, Paul White. Mm-hmm. What an amazing manager he is. and this was really lovely because, I was early to the whole sort of space, and this kind of collaborative conversation, putting everything on the table, giving people an opportunity to express themselves and foster an environment where we all trust that whatever we say will be respected and considered. And you could almost see, at least from me, I don't know how the others were taking it, but I could almost see times when, as a group, we were clearly going in the wrong direction, right? And I'm sure he would have seen it from a mile away because he's got a ton of experience. But he just let it go, right? And let that process occur. But after we came around and recognised that it's not working, we would have that shared appreciation that it doesn't work because we've all tried that. We all agreed on that, and now we agree that it doesn't work. And so there's this kind of adoption of, a shared belief system or meaning or why we're doing it in a particular way. But there's an art form to this. It takes lots of time. There were there were lots of meetings that we had, all this regularity of them. And I think, Paul White, if you're listening, you did an amazing job. I think, there's a lot to be said about, what managers, and not only that, actually, let me rephrase that, what all of us can do as part of a team to foster that, whether you're a manager or whether you're, a senior executive or whether you're HR or whether you're whatever position, right? Whatever role you act, for you to have your say or your voice or to provide feedback, and because as you say, this is an organism that works together, that hopefully isn't tethered by, fear, but rather works together and shares that space.
Yeah. No, it's a great example of giving the space, isn't it, to individuals to express themselves and then to form into a collective. So that piece that I outlined there with the school is kind of our vanilla version, if you like. It's the version I write about, we wrote about in the book. Individual matrix, collective matrix, core design principle conversations, and then goal setting and tracking over time. But I wanted to share with you a couple of other examples interesting examples of how it's being used. One is a group that we're just getting started now. It's a European Social Research Council funded grant in the UK. And what we're doing is bringing together a whole bunch of civil society groups, university academics, local councils, transition network and other environmental groups and so forth. And they're coming onto the Prosocial Facilitator training that I do. I should back up a little and just explain. I teach this method. You can get online, prosocialinstitute.org, and you'll see connections to the Prosocial Facilitator training. It's a 10-week course. It's got a fair bit of online content, but most of it is about discussion and practice and really diving into these ideas. Well, we're doing a 10-week course like that for these civil society groups and around sustainability. And what I'm finding really interesting about this is instead of a bunch of individuals coming together to have the conversation, we've got 10 different teams, really some pretty high-powered folks coming along, and they're each going to be working internally within their teams to help improve and implement Prosocial, but they're also going to be having conversations across the teams as well. So that's another kind of form of intervention process, is to take pre-existing groups and to get them having conversations that matter across groups, if you see what I mean. So we're really interested in trying to...
Very powerful.
Yeah. I mean, this is the missing link in a way. There's a million team development methodologies around for individual teams, but there's very little in the space of groups of groups. How do we actually get groups to cooperate across boundaries between us and them, And just look at our political discourse about how we need that. It's so much easier to ignore the humanity of the other in another group, an entirely different group. So the groups of groups issue is one that really excites me, and this is where I think prosocial has such phenomenal potential. The other kind of broad approach that is interesting to me is doing some work in Bhutan, of all places. We're going to Bhutan in April, and we're working with the senior figures in the public service there, in the civil service there, to basically develop a 5-year strategic plan. And they called me because they were particularly interested in creating a more prosocial society. And so how can these principles be applied at the level of the entire society, if you like? And that's the conversation that we're going to be having over a 5-year period, over developing a strategic plan for the 5-year period. So there's lots of ways that you can apply prosocial.
It must be very exciting for you to see this sort of work starting to effectively shape policy, right? To that where governments, organisations, large companies, people who are in power to start asking, this harder question. How can we do this better for all of us, not just for those in power, or to capture more resources? How can we spread the resource? How can we do this better so that we all have a better quality of life?
Yeah, it's as you were saying that, as I was saying it, I was just so excited by the possibility. And of course, it's not just us alone. This is bubbling up everywhere. The whole move towards more participatory democracy. There are conversations in dozens, hundreds, thousands of organisations about how we can shape policy to take into account what we actually care about, as opposed to just money and consumption.
I'll tell you what, I sat through one of your lectures or workshops at the ACBS conference, and we're talking about obviously this and trying to do it as a collective, and some of those things, and obviously it was only a short morning, so to speak, but I took some of those things into our team here, and I think it's been transformational. There's a lot to be said about what you can learn from just spending a little bit of time on those 18 concepts, if you will, or contributors to prosocial, and even though it would have been, or continues probably to be, a fairly clumsy application of it, the fact that we're applying it means that feedback loop is occurring. We're teaching one another how we want to be. The fact that the conversation's there, at all, is testament that it's the group. So I think your workshops. I've only had a taster, but it has a lot of merit and value. How can people find out about the training that you currently do? Maybe how people can find out about your book, where they can get the book. To learn more and start to think about it. Whether it's at their community level, whether it's about advocating for playgrounds, near themselves, and how community can do that better, or more research, or whether it be at that very, very high end of maybe government departments or large companies, or important topics like climate change and the like.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Nesh. So there are lots of ways to go forward. One of the easiest is to buy the book. If you just Google prosocial and Paul Atkins, one of the top links will be a link to one of your favourite booksellers. It's available everywhere. But you can also go to our website for our whole initiative, which is www.prosocial.world, WORLD. And from there, you'll find links to both the facilitator training and also the book. Once you've done the facilitator training, we have a community of practice. We're just in the middle of developing a new platform that's going to basically give anybody a whole bunch of tools to help implement more effective groups together. So people will be able to join the community. They'll be able to download, guides around the ACT matrix or the core design principles, and they'll be helped through the process, if you like, of implementing prosocial in their groups. Get involved in the community, and we have a regular monthly newsletter that we produce, which is updating people on what's happening. We've been in the process of developing a sort of version 1.0 of our platform. We're about to introduce a version 2.0, which is really going to put some of these tools into a new space that's going to make them super useful for people and readily available. But start with reading about the idea in the book, and maybe explore the facilitator training if it's something you feel like you'd like to lead groups in a more prosocial way, lead groups towards more effective collective action, then certainly love to hear from you. There are two websites that I've mentioned. One is prosocial.world and the other is prosocialinstitute.org. Basically, the Prosocial Institute is kind of the training arm of our bigger effort, which we're calling prosocial.world. On the Prosocial Institute page, you can book an appointment with me. Happy to talk to people about their needs, and there's just a space there where you can book in a short conversation and we can chat about what your needs are. So probably best to start with those two websites.
Yeah, brilliant. Very generous as well of you. I think the book is probably a great place to start. And I'm assuming you said, all good booksellers, that's Amazon and
it's pretty widely available, yeah. I mean, if you go to the website and you can click on a link there and it'll take you to their Amazon site in whatever country you're in. But of course, lots of other places sell it as well.
I think this whole concept is well overdue to put it on paper, and I know this isn't obviously the first time it's been explored. This is an extension of some great work from Lynn and many others, and putting in evolutionary work and biology and so on and so forth. But what a beautiful package that we can all kind of at least use as a flexible skeleton to start this conversation and evolve it even further. So, yeah, love your work, Paul. I think it's just bloody awesome.
Truly Australian way to end an interview. Thank you, Nesh. I appreciate it. It's been a real delight talking with you. I've actually found this. I'm going to go back and listen to this conversation because I've come up with a bunch of new ideas just chatting with you. So it's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Well, hopefully I can get you back on the show at some point, maybe with a bit of an update as to some of the work that you've done to date, and maybe hear about how your work in Bhutan has gone.
Thank you. Yeah, it's going to be exciting.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Nesh.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review. Subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.